The feeding of the 5,000, that right. Miraculous event is such a good one for thinking about scarcity versus abundance. And the disciples come and they're like, Jesus, you got this whole crowd of people. How are you going to feed all these people? And Jesus is like, well, what do you got? Right? And he will use what you got. Welcome to Hallway Conversations. We're a trio of educators who have plenty of questions about teaching and learning and school culture, and we believe in the value of collaboration and reflection as we seek to keep growing as teachers. So this podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about issues in education and why they might matter to Christian educators. Welcome to the conversation.
Hello everyone, welcome to Hallway Conversations. My name is Matt Beamers.
I'm Abby DeGroat.
And I'm Dave Mulder.
For those of you new here, we're trying to create space where people can play around with a few ideas in the context of what it means to teach and lead Christianly. And one of our deep hopes is that you might be encouraged to go back to your classroom, your staff room, your hallway, and engage in your own hallway conversations. We also love it when listeners give us feedback, suggest show ideas, or have questions for us. So if you feel compelled to do so, please send that to hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. That's hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. Today we're going to continue with our series on the book Flourishing Together by Andy Wolfe and Lynn Swaner. I know that each of us has appreciated Lynn and Andy's wisdom, and it's encouraged each of us to reflect on our own practice. For that alone, Andy and Lynn, we will give thanks to you. Dave and Abby, part 4 is on resources. And so before we begin, we often begin with a check-in question. And today's check-in question is loosely tied to this concept of resources. But when I started reading, or before I even started reading, I was thinking about the resources that my own teachers had at their disposal when I was a child, way back in the early 80s at John Knox Christian School in Burnaby, British Columbia. And I couldn't help but think about technology, quote unquote, back in the day. And I remember being completely in awe of the film projector.
Oh, yeah.
So just to give a context, I grew up in a house that either didn't have a television, or when we did, it was a small black and white, like 11, 13-inch TV that obviously didn't have a remote, had rabbit ears. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about right now. So it was stunning to me as a kid that a teacher could attach what looked like a wheel to this machine and push play, and it would play these images in color and voices and exposed a whole world to me of learning that I didn't know existed. And I loved it. I also remember that the bigger the wheel, the longer the movie.
Yes, you could tell.
And I was totally tracking with that as a kid. So when a small wheel came out, I was like, that's only going to be about 10 minutes. When a big wheel came out, I'd be like, we are here for the duration of the afternoon.
I love it.
And better yet, once in a while, if we really behaved, the teacher would play the film backwards. And the thought of it right now as I'm sitting and thinking about it is making me smile. So, my check-in question for you is, when I talk about resources, or if you think about resources that were new to you as a kid or a teenager or elementary school, what sort of comes to mind? Abby, has anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, there's like the obvious one of, I remember the first time I went on the internet.
Wow. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Wow.
Like I was a 7th grader.
Really? At school? You were at school?
I was at the library, actually.
Wow.
In town.
Yeah.
Yeah, like doing a report on something.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's that one. But I think the one I want to talk about is when I was in 4th grade, this is the best. My teacher got from the local, I think it was from the AEA, so the Area Education Agency. She got a Star Lab.
Oh, yeah.
For our class.
It's amazing.
I've never heard of that
Oh,
before.
my word. So we moved all of our desks to the perimeter of the room, and it's this big thing that you actually, like, put a fan in and blow up, and it's like a dome.
Yeah.
And you go inside, and it's pitch black, and she has the ability to, like, put the stars in the constellation of this dome. And so we learned all about the stars and recognizing the constellations, and we were sitting inside like this in the dark learning about the stars, and it was amazing.
Yeah, I would love that today. Love that today. That's amazing.
Yeah, so that would be probably my one that sticks out. Right? Awesome. It's like for a period of time that we had this Star Lab, and it would just like blow up, and we would go in it and sit in it.
I would love that too. I
that's
get
cool.
why that's such a positive memory
really
for
cool.
you. How about you, Dave?
So my first thought was I can remember being in like first and second grade. I'm old enough that we still had instead of a photocopier like the mimeograph machine.
my goodness!
And like the smell of a freshly mimeographed.
Okay, now we have listeners.
Who are too young for that business.
Yeah. So what is a mimeograph, Dave? Like,
I don't even know how the thing works, to be honest with you, but it's like some kind of a printing.
It was like ink,
yeah,
right?
And you would like crank the pages through instead of on a photocopier. And so they were like purple-ish.
Yeah.
And if they were freshly printed,
Yeah.
they had like a smell to them.
Yeah.
And I remember that. It's such a silly, fond memory.
Yeah, that's good.
Smells.
Yeah.
Oh, catch memory, right?
Well, that's like a biological thing.
Yeah.
Smell is your strongest memory.
tied to memory.
Guys, when I started reading, I really enjoyed this section, as I have the other. But I really, as I shared to Abby earlier in the hallway, I was really captured. My imagination was captured by this idea of abundance and scarcity, and it actually made a connection for me. Many years ago, I went to a lecture at Regent College with Walter Bruggeman, who for me is always sort of a modern day Old Testament prophet. Like, I love reading him. It always makes me feel uncomfortable, and I'm always thankful for it. So I actually want to start with a bit of a longer Bruggeman quote that talks about scarcity and abundance. And then I'm going to just ask you to maybe make some connections, and then we'll see where the discussion goes. So here's what Bruggeman says. Everywhere Jesus goes, the world is rearranged. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are freed from debt. The forgiveness of debts is listed last because it's the hardest thing to do, harder even than raising the dead to life. Jesus left ordinary people dazzled, amazed, and grateful. He left powerful people angry and upset because every time he performed a wonder, they lost a little of their clout. The wonders of the new age of the coming of God's kingdom may scandalize and upset us. They dazzle us, but they also make us nervous. The people of God need pastoral help in processing this ambivalent sense of both deeply yearning for God's new creation and deeply fearing it. The feedings of the multitude, recorded in Mark's gospel, is an example of the new world coming into being through God. When the disciples charged with feeding the hungry crowd found a child with 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus took, blessed, broke, and gave the bread. He demonstrated that the world is filled with abundance and freighted with generosity. If bread is broken and shared, there is enough for all. Jesus is engaged in the sacramental, subversive reordering of public reality. So as I was reading through this, I felt like I had Bruggeman on my shoulder, who often talks about a theology of abundance and a myth of scarcity, and and a wonder for me is if that is a bit of the Christian education story, is that a bit of our approach as parents in terms of how we look at resources that we have and living tight-fisted versus open-handed with what God has blessed us with. So I don't know, I want to throw that quote out there and put it on you to just, hey, your initial reactions either to that or even to connect it to what Lynn and Andy talked about in this section.
Yeah, so I wrote down too that scarcity, they talk about in this chapter, the first one, I think, scarcity does not equal disparity. So having like a mindset of abundance and avoiding that feelings of scarcity does not erase the fact that there are wide disparities among different populations. And I think I really learned that when I was in my doctoral program, when I read deeply and widely about some of the resource disparities that exist in public education, especially in this country. And then I think about what my kids have and how do I reconcile my role as a Christian, right? Because they also talk about it's our biblical mandate to correct oppression. And so as Christians, and so I don't know, what does that look like? So I struggle with that a little bit inside the Christian education world?
Yeah.
What does it look like for us to, because it's almost a different system than the public system here, right? And so how do those two things mesh? Is it simply a matter of opening up choice? I don't think so, because there's location and there are all of these other barriers. Like that could be part of the puzzle. I don't think it answers that question completely.
It's a wrestling.
It's a wrestling. So I have no answers other than to say how I thought about it and how I approached. That part.
I really appreciated their contrasting of a scarcity mindset and an abundance mindset, right? And the good news of the gospel is like we have abundance, in many ways, right?
And how can we steward that?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And yet there was a question right at the beginning of the first chapter in this section, right, about will we have enough to meet the needs of our students, and that that question, will we have enough? Like I feel that. Like what how much is enough, right? That begs the question, how much is enough then, to say will we have enough? And boy, I'm not proud of that, right? That I worry about that, but I do. Like I worry about how do we resource schools really well to do the work that they need to do? How do we resource teachers really well to do the work they need to do? How do we equip students with what they need to do the learning they need? And all of that has costs. And so that was the connection, I guess, that I made when I started thinking about resources too. It's like, well, everything costs. And in an age of inflation, it costs more. So what does that mean?
No, it also made me just think about what does it mean to steward our students well, to steward our faculty well. Like one of the things that they talked about is this idea of how like our teachers are the best textbook. And I really like that idea, like what's the potential of our faculty in terms of the gifts that they bring, the gifts of God that they have for the people of God, their students, and just wondering about how might we care for them, care for those teachers better. How do we steward our relationship with our teachers better? It made me think about, I think it's Southwest Airlines, who talk about the employees at the center of their company. Like if you instead of the customer, the employees at the center of their company, if you take care of the employee, they will take care of the customer. And it made me think about that for teachers as I read this. And I know it's a different context. And I know, of course, and I'm so thankful for when we say, hey, what's best for students? But it did make me wonder in terms of how do we protect the resource of our teachers?
Well, and one of the things that Lynn and Andy bring up in the book is this idea of stewarding. When we talk about stewarding, we have to think of stewarding resources and stewarding money, but stewarding time. And that one really caught me, because I think that's usually when push comes to shove for me, it's not about the money, it's about the time. And like, am I being fairly compensated for the work that I'm doing? We should ask that question. That's part of the conversation. But time is always the problem, right? There's never enough time to do the things that I want to do or that I feel like I should do. And so you think about that for teachers, right? The kind of investment of time that they're making into the lives of their students, boy, we should steward that really, really well. How do we ensure that teachers have time to rest? How do we ensure teachers have time to play, to do things besides their work? I think that's equally important.
Right, absolutely.
It also made me think about, as I was reading through this, it also made me realize when I was a principal, how much time I spent thinking about the scarcity of enrollment. Like that was, that for me, that was an idol for me, if I'm honest. Like
Can you explain that a little bit when you say scarcity of enrollment?
Yeah, like we're not going to have enough students. Or if we don't get enough students, how might the superintendent of our school judge my performance as a principal? Now, I'm not saying he ever suggested that to me.
Right.
I'm saying I thought about that. That was the story I was telling myself in my head.
Sure.
If you were a better principal, this school would be growing at a more rapid rate, right? And so what ends up happening then is what do we have to do to grow this school? What resources do we need to make our school more appealing to the public, right? And it wasn't, and for me, it wasn't at times, we need to equip our teachers, or we need, professional development, professional learning community. What technology out there might others see make us a more appealing choice in the school down the road? And what ends up happening then, and I think this can happen in all parts of our lives, is instead of making good decisions based on the mission and the vision and the promise statement that we make to parents about who we're trying to be, is we're just grabbing at anything that will make us more appealing. And in fact, you end up comparing yourself. So now you're looking at the school down the road or the university down the road and say, well, what are they doing that we're not doing? Well, then we need to do that.
Right. Versus stewarding what we have well.
That's right. And rooted in the mission and vision of the school, right? In a sense, your mission and vision then becomes, well, whatever everyone else is doing, we need to do that. Well, that doesn't capture anyone's imagination, and then that's based in scarcity. Like we're not enough, and that other school is clearly more. We need what they have. So when they talked about this idea about the scarcity of enrollment, I couldn't help but think about that and feel convicted of that. I did not always do that well. We never had enough students. We always needed more. What do we need to do to get them through the front door?
Well, and that's a really important question for schools to grapple with, right? Like, how do you right size? Like, what's the should we always be trying to grow as an institution? I think there are ways in which we should be growing, but I don't think the number of students is always the right metric for are we doing what we think we're doing.
Another idea that was kind of revolutionary for me as I was reading was this idea of the students themselves as resources, and not in the way as like they're paying tuition, but as agents, right, of restoration. I'm just going to read a quote that I jotted down. Genuine agency of students achieved by placing them in front and center of our thinking and planning releases tremendous opportunity in the present and can also set students on a trajectory of influence and leadership for the rest of their lives, right? And so I go back to that tour we took of High Tech High, and thinking about the way that those students, that the school had invested in those students to lead guests around, right? I showed a video to one of my classes yesterday of another project-based site where the student was actually facilitating the class discussion about the next project.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right? So how do we see our students as resources, invest in them, and then give them agency to do good work in our communities and to be those agents of restoration?
Because at one point they end up talking about stewarding our students' potential, and they talk about how do we invite them into places where they can, I think the language they use is pursue justice, relieve oppression, defend the right of the exploited. And I love the language Andy and Lynn here when they talk about what do like shalom-filled relationships within our community, right? And I think that's where do you help them to realize the abundance that God has already equipped them with as 5 and 10 and 15-year-olds. Like they talk pretty clearly about, hey, like the potential of young children, right? Of like what are they able to do? And I just made me realize it just reminds me of how do we get our young children into our neighborhoods, right? For them to better understand who their neighbor is, and that actually that they will be blessed, but that they can be a blessing actually, right? They have something to offer their neighbor.
And if that's true, how do we invest in relationships?
Yeah.
Over buildings and over materials. Like if that's our biggest priority, and if that's the biggest bang for your buck, does your balance sheet show that?
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't always think it does.
It does make me realize, right? Like if people visited, I'll just use my home for example. If they looked at our budget, what would they say what would they assume we valued, right? And what might that look like in our schools and in our institutions, right? Is if this is what we're saying we're on about in our mission and vision statement, how does the budget support that? Because it needs to, because otherwise the audio and the video aren't aligning there.
What do you guys make of their chapter about breaking bread? So they have a whole chapter in here. They try to use metaphors for different things, and the imagery of bread in Scripture is such a rich metaphor,
beautiful,
right? And you think of all the times where we talk about breaking bread, and Jesus at the Last Supper breaking bread, and all these
feeding
places.
the 5,000.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. All those biblical images. That really caught my imagination in I thought it was a really helpful way to make it tangible, right? And like the feeding of the 5,000, that miraculous event is such a good one for thinking about scarcity versus abundance. And the disciples come and they're like, Jesus, you got this whole crowd of people. How are you going to feed all these people? And Jesus is like, well, what do you got? Right. And he will use what you got. Right. And they went and they picked up how many basketfuls afterward, right? Like there was more than enough. There was abundance from this little boy's lunch.
Yeah, like you did that with this?
Right. And like that was actually a really inspirational piece for me in thinking about this. Like how often is my vision so limited? And you know, I wonder about that. Like if we had more of a kingdom vision for like the abundance of what is possible, we might not have a lot. But what can God do with that little bit that we're willing to put out there? Right?
For schools that want to raise money, they're going to do a capital campaign, right? Like it's also okay to plan that to see what is our community capable of giving. Like let's do a study on that. Like to do both, right? To put our trust in God. Also doesn't always mean, well, we're just going to fly by the seat of our pants. And this is why it was interesting to me that on the one hand, it's like, hey, we give us today our daily bread. And then they also had on page 166 the importance of strategic planning.
Right.
So it felt for me a bit of a paradox, and I don't think it was, but it just felt for me. Because they said marshaling the right people to do the right jobs with the right resources to achieve the right goal at the right time, which I think the right time is actually a really important part there, is one of the highest callings of the steward leader. Strategic planning is one of the highest forms of organizational leadership. And it's like, and I like this idea because we've talked before about like how do you get the right people on the right bus doing the right things, but then they also go on to say like how do you nurture those people? So it's not just getting them in the right place, but how do you nurture that? So it was just interesting to me, right? This on the one hand, for sure, like put our trust and faith in God, right? All good gifts are from Him, but have a plan. So there was sort of this.
Well, and that's one of the things I appreciated, and I never caught this part of it, but Lynn and Andy, when they laid this out in the book and they're talking about the feeding of the 5,000, there's a plan there too. Jesus tells the disciples, like, go have them sit down in groups of 50, right? Like, it's not like willy-nilly. Like, there was a plan to this too. And I think there again, like, both of those things can be true. Yes, trust that God is big enough and powerful enough to do it, and yet He works through His people.
Here's some ways that this is going to happen.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because at one point they say a Christian vision for education views each challenge from an orientation of possibility. And I love that, right? Like we start with what is possibility. But again, in the possibility, how might we make that come real, right? What is the right way to go about? What does a plan look like? What needs to happen in terms of human resources, capital, to make that possibility a reality? And so again, it's like we said, both things are true there.
I had one note in the last section of each, or last chapter of each section. They have just some reflective prompts and stuff. And there was one, the first reflection for educators in this one. There was just the line in there in italics, "You are good enough," and I that caught me. Like I had an emotional reaction to that, and I think it's because of my Dutch Calvinist upbringing that says I am not enough, right? Somehow that I have to somehow and just that reminder, like you are good enough. God says the things He creates are good. You are good. You're good enough.
It just makes me think as we're coming out of Easter, this idea, right, of His grace is sufficient for you and for me, right? And how do we humble ourselves before God in our brokenness as professionals in our personal life, as people made in the image of God, to know that we are not enough without Him, and yet He loves us no matter what. And that would be our prayer for our listeners too, as you go into this week, that to know that God delights in you, and He looks down on each of us in our brokenness, and still says, "Well done, good and faithful servants." Friends, as you go into this week, we just want to send you with a blessing. God go before you to lead you. God go behind you to protect you. God go beneath you to support you. God go beside you to befriend you. Do not be afraid. May the blessing of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon you. Do not be afraid. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good week.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Thanks for listening. Like, you're going to judge me for this, but like, you talk about kids sniffing markers and things like that, but like the smell of the old Expo marker, not the Expo 2s, they don't smell as good.
Yeah.
There's something about those original whiteboard.
Ooh, do you remember rubber cement?
Yeah,
that had a smell. Yeah.
Is this why we became teachers?
No,
all the weird smells?
For those of you born in the late 90s and early 2000s, thank you for indulging our memory.